Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Let me first thank the extraordinary leadership of my vice chair, Representative Rashida Tlaib, who's been planning this hearing for almost a year, and who, since day one of being on this committee as my vice chair, has said we have to hold corporations accountable for pollution. We have to look at the impact on vulnerable communities in my district, and has just been relentless. And it's to her testament that in 2 years we haven't had a field hearing in my district or any other member's district, but we're having one in her district. So thank you, and I'm going to, after my statement, hand it over to her for her to chair the rest of the hearing. And I want to recognize just someone who I have the deepest admiration for, Debbie Dingell, who is one of the strongest voices in Congress on bringing production back, manufacturing back, but also on social justice, on racial justice. Many of us look to her for her guidance, for her wisdom as a bridge builder, and it says everything that she's here. Even though she's not on this committee, she's making the effort to be here today, and I just want to recognize how much we appreciate your being here. So with that, we're here in Detroit to recognize the voices of residents and activists who are fighting an unjust burden of pollution in the air they breathe and the water they drink. This morning, I met with Mr. Shobe. Representative Tlaib and I were there, and we saw the Stellantis plant. And the fact is that right in Mr. Shobe's backyard, you could actually smell the pollution. And it wasn't more than probably a few thousand feet at most that that plant was located. And look, all of us on this panel, all of us are for bringing manufacturing jobs and good jobs, but that should not come at the expense of vulnerable communities. And there's no reason that Stellantis, now they're sitting in their headquarters in the Netherlands, so they don't have to live in this community, but they need to be accountable. There's no reason that they can't have mitigation so that there's not awful pollutants devastating that community. And they, at the very least, should be offering to buy the community the houses there for people who want to sell and get out and not face that kind of pollution. So I know Representative Tlaib has brought this up a number of times, and we'll explore it. And this is a hearing where we're going to take action afterwards. It's not just to hear people's voices, and we're going to figure out with Representative Tlaib's leadership what we need to do to Stellantis to make sure they're complying with American law, that they're caring about American communities, and they can't have a license, even if they're headquartered in Europe, to do damage to our communities in America. That's not right, that's not fair, and we want to hold them accountable. The reality is, for far too long, vulnerable communities have faced pollution as a compounded problem, and that's something I understood from Representative Tlaib, that it's not just the Flint crisis where you hear, okay, there's not clean drinking water. It's often communities don't have clean drinking water because of lead, and then on top of that they have air pollution, and on top of that they may have pollution from a refinery, and all of these things add up, and there's a cumulative impact. And the reality is that if you're in Warren, Michigan, as the representative was explaining this morning, you may not have the impact there. But if you're in poorer communities and if you're in black communities, then it's licensed to pollute. That's just wrong. That's wrong. That doesn't give people dignity. And that's really the purpose of this hearing today. It is to explore how we make sure that every community can have air that they can breathe, water that they can drink, can have their kids go out in the backyard and not smell smoke. I mean, it's not asking for that much. And it's not putting jobs in conflict with the environment. We can do both. We can build new plants and have those plants be environmentally sustainable. That's what this president has done with the Inflation Reduction Act that is talking about clean manufacturing. That's what this president's done with the climate the climate provisions, where he wants to make sure, and the Congress wants to make sure, that we are actually having clean air, clean water as we build new jobs. And I'm a co-sponsor of the Environment Justice for All Act, which would order the EPA to not only require permit applications to submit analysis that show the cumulative impacts of pollution, but would require the EPA to deny permits where applicants can't demonstrate a reasonable likelihood of causing no harm. I'm committed to fighting alongside Representative Tlaib and Dingell to block dirty infrastructure, to make sure we don't walk in decades of further pollution in communities that are considered expendable, which unfortunately too many have been in our country. Currently, there's a proposal circulating in Congress that would make it actually easier to build polluting facilities, that was helped drafted by the American Petroleum Institute. We will be having a hearing on September 15th on that to make sure that those proposals don't become law. I'll close again with sincere thanks to Representative Dingell for her leadership and for joining this committee and her commitment, and to Representative Tlaib for holding this hearing. She is a true environmental justice leader and has been sounding the alarm on these issues in Detroit for decades, even calling for a cumulative impact study after the Marathon refinery fire in 2011. I'm proud to work with both Representative Dingell and with Representative Tlaib. Since she's the vice chair, and since this whole hearing was her idea, I now hand over the gavel to Representative Tlaib so she can chair the rest of the hearing.
Thank you so much to Congressman, our chairman. You know, I was like, I really don't want to chair it. I want to be able to question and get a lot of these things in the committee, but I really respect that he knows this is my district, and I will help lead this committee in making sure that my incredibly strong and wonderful and beautiful residents are able to be heard, and to be able to, again, forever have this into the congressional record. Thank you to our House Oversight Committee is led by Chairwoman Maloney, and I want to recognize her in allowing us to be able to do these kinds of field hearings. I want to recognize, of course, our chairman for, instantly saying yes and working with my team and making sure this happened. Of course, my incredible double trouble partner when it comes to the fight for clean air and clean water, and that's Congresswoman Debbie Dingell, who, even if it's, Cleveland Cliffs in her backyard, or if it's Marathon Oil in my backyard, we show up for each other, and we understand that there is no wall or barrier when it comes to clean air. We are all impacted by that, and so I just cannot thank her for her courage. And the fact is, when I'm upset, she's calm, and she's upset, I'm calm, and it really does work in the best interest of our residents when we are able to advocate on their behalf. I do want to set the stage of our hearing today with some numbers. $400 million. That's at least how much money, public money, was given to Stellantis. I think I remember a resident this morning saying it was $423 million. In 2019, they expanded with that money to their Detroit Assembly Complex. In a city just a few years out of bankruptcy, in a state struggling to find funding to fix our crumbling infrastructure, we had more than $400 million to offer a company that makes billions each year. Another number, 94%. That's the neighborhood surrounding Stellantis plant right now is 94% black. In order to receive their air permit to pollute more in a black neighborhood in our backyard, Stellantis agreed to decrease its pollution from its Warren plant, which is about 66% white. And again, everyone deserves the right to breathe clean air, but I think it's important to understand they chose our community to pollute more. 15,000. That's how much Stellantis and the city of Detroit agreed to provide each qualifying resident living on Beneteau directly next to the plant for home repairs that were supposed to protect them from pollution. 15,000 was an arbitrary decided number, inadequate to pay for the foundation, the roofing, the windows, air filters, heating, and cooling upgrades that residents need to be able to be safe in their homes. 5, that's how many violations notices the state of Michigan has issued to Stellantis in less than a year, since September 20th, 2021, for the air pollution and horrible odors caused by Stellantis' expansion and failure to properly install pollution controls, which went undetected for over 6 months. And if it wasn't for our residents making those complaints, we would have never known that they were polluting outside of what their air permit required. After receiving $400 million in free money and a license to pollute a majority black neighborhood, they couldn't even be bothered to install the pollution controls correctly. And residents are still waiting 11 months later for enforcement action by the state of Michigan. Sadly, this is a story we can repeat in neighborhood after neighborhood across Michigan, our city, Wayne County, and really across the nation. 35. That's how many violation notices state has issued U.S. Ecology in the city of Detroit since 2014, 9 of which have been issued since a consent decree was entered less than 2 years ago in 2020. Understand this, EPA decided to enforce, call the Department of Justice, and they decided to enter a consent decree to enforce what they were supposed to protect the public. And since that consent decree, 9 violations. 14, that's how many years residents who live near U.S. Ecology South have been waiting for the state of Michigan to decide whether it will renew the facility's operating permit. 7, that's 7 violation notices that AK still now called Cleveland Cliffs and Congresswoman Debbie Dingell's district since 2019. That's how many violations they've gotten. 8 violation notices by Levy Company and Congresswoman Dingell's district during that time. 13 more violation notices by U.S. Steel and the EAS Coke Battery, and I can go on, including Marathon Petroleum and, of course, the Detroit Water and Sewage Department in my district over the last 3 years. How would you feel about living in an area where you had to breathe air that was contaminated with at least 28 permit violations in the last 3 years? Talk to someone in 48217 zip code in my district, and you can find out. I could do this all day and continue to tell you all of this, but one thing I told Chairman Khanna is that the system is broken, because since these consent decrees, for instance, towards Cleveland Cliffs, they entered a consent decree in 2015. The deal was resolved, right? They've cut a deal, they get a consent decree. They've had 40 plus violations at that plant since that consent decree. For instance, in U.S. Steel in Zug Island, on October 2014, as well as others consent decrees, a number of them, they've had, at least in the last 10 years, 40 plus violations as well. Our current environmental permitting and enforcement systems are sacrificing black, brown, and immigrant and low-income communities, working class communities, for profits of corporate polluters. And we have an urgent moral duty, y'all, to build new systems and structures that put our health and environment first. Permitting systems that fail to take cumulative impacts into account should not exist. Enforcement systems that allow companies to continue racking up unlimited number of violations notices as they continue to do business as usual, again, should not exist. This should be common sense for everyone to understand, because I'm thrilled that you will all get to hear today from these courageous residents who are standing up to mega billion-dollar corporations. They're in frontline communities fighting for environmental justice, fighting against environmental racism. And it's not just here in Detroit, but really across the country. We're hearing from indigenous communities and other communities that are really being sacrificed for corporate polluting profits. Hopefully, when you do decide, and those listening, to put yourself in the shoes of our residents, you will feel the urgency to move quickly to fix these structures. You're also going to hear from those residents' partners in these fights. These are our local experts. These are the folks that come into our community and meet with us and talk to us directly. They're the lawyers, the organizers, the academics who make our environmental justice movement so strong and vibrant. So I'm so incredibly thrilled that you're going to be hearing from them. I'll end with this. 0. 0 should be our target. 0 children with asthma from concentration of corporate polluters. 0 elders and seasoned residents with cancer from breathing air tainted by corporations under toothless consent decrees. And 0 neighbors sacrificed. I know a better world is possible, and I'll continue to be that corny, optimistic member of the United States Congress, because I know better is possible, and that, again, all of us have the right to breathe clean air. And it shouldn't be this hard in one of the most wealthiest countries in the world to push back against corporate profit. And so again, I thank you and I yield back. Oh, I go, since I'm chairing, great. I ask unanimous consent to allow Representative Dingle to join our committee, I believe. I ask for unanimous consent that Rep. Dingle be allowed to participate in today's hearing without objection. So ordered. Okay. I'm going to recognize Congresswoman Dingle. Now, I do want you all to know I've known Congresswoman Dingle before I became a member of the United States Congress. When it comes to her residents, there's a fire in her belly that comes out, and it's incredible to watch and witness. And so we are incredibly blessed to have her there. If it wasn't for her, we would never have been able to get over $1 billion to stop water shutoffs in our country. And this $1.1 billion investment into making sure that people have access to water during the pandemic was because of her leadership on Energy and Commerce Committee. She is a person that cares deeply not only about wildlife and leading that effort, but really about making sure that people that are living in the backyard of corporate polluters are being protected and being taken care of. And with that, I yield to my amazing and wonderful colleague, Congresswoman Debbie Dingle.
Thank you, Rashida, for those kind words. And it's really great for both of us to welcome our colleague, Rob Khanna, to Michigan. He really is a fighter on the national stage, and he helps bring attention to all of the issues that we're here to fight about. And when they asked me if I could come, I have to apologize. I'm going to have to leave after about an hour because the governor's going to be downriver on another subject that we all care about. But this subject really matters. I spent the day yesterday just touring sites with the EPA regional administrator. We were in Wyandotte looking at BASF, who's discharging pollution every single day into the Detroit River. We went to Arkema site, which is just a deserted site, and nobody's doing anything about it. And until we address that, we cannot do more things that we want to do in continuing the cleanup of the Detroit River. These are all the things I'm going to work on with Sri on a lot. We went to McLeod Steel. We did get McLeod Steel down, but there's still the Superfund site there. And what did I have to welcome her but another chemical spill in my district? Tuesday night in Trenton. Just look at the number of chemical spills that's been in my district alone this year. The Flat Rock spill, and then a second Flat Rock spill. The horrific spill in the Huron River by Tri-Bar, which is that we can't eat fish in the Huron River right now because of Tri-Bar's PFAS spill 4 years ago, and now they're putting another poison into the river. And, you know, I personally think it's criminal. I think they need to be held criminally liable. I think they need to be shut down. I'm not hiding how I feel about that anymore. We've got the plume. There are so many issues for all of us. Rashida highlighted a lot of them in this area, and then we share, as you all know. It will now become Rashida's. Sri, our soon-to-be colleague, is going to pick up some of the areas that we're representing, and he's going to be right there with us because we care about all of these areas, and it's just simply not okay. And unless you're all loud, right, like you are, if we don't keep pushing and pushing and pushing, we're not going to get the changes that we need. So I'm really, I'm just honored to be here. The current laws and regulations that we have in frontline communities has left too many behind, and it's exposed too many to harmful pollution. This is a true story. I was with, I don't know if I was with you, but you heard everybody talk about it. I was at Stellantis school, and I had an asthma attack when we were doing a town hall meeting. I had to go out. You know, we hear the kids are having it. I had one. I had to go out and get my inhaler. From the air that they breathe to the water that they're drinking to the land that they call home, our priorities have failed too many families in the frontline communities and has allowed corporate polluters to continue to put profits over health and the safety of our environment and communities. This is why I fought so hard to improve the lives with Rashida and Ro for our frontline communities by prioritizing policies, and we got some things done. We have made some progress. It's why I'm the lead sponsor in the House of Representatives of the Thrive Act, which represents a blueprint for economic renewal backed by movement of activists, including unions, racial justice, climate, and other grassroots groups. and we need you to all help us get this legislation through. So thank you to everybody that's here, the witnesses that are testifying, and to my two colleagues who never stop fighting to bring attention to this. And you know what? We just have to make as much noise as we can so they can't ignore us. We will not be ignored. Thank you, and I yield back.
I want to recognize these are our witnesses. Our first witness will be Robert Shobe. Our second witness will be Pamela McGee, and our third witness will be Ms. Redding. If all three of you can please please stand, maybe raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you so much. Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. The witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Mr. Shobe, you are recognized for your testimony.
Good morning. Good morning, committee members and congressional staff and those gathered here today. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Robert Shobe. I've lived on Benito Street for 27 years. My home is one of the closest to the Stellantis plant, where they assemble and paint the new Jeep Grand Cherokee. My life has been deeply impacted living next to Stellantis. Most importantly, I want to share that it's still happening. Even after 5 air quality violations, entered into an enforcement process after appealing to elected officials, decision makers, it's still happening. I frequently call Eagle. I try to call every time I smell paint, but I don't go outside as much these days. The last time I called when I wrote this letter was Monday. I've called twice since then, the following 2 days. There's been no interruption of work. Jeep continues to get sprayed and rolled off the line daily. This plant is making us sick. I'm a cancer patient, I'm physically disabled, I suffer from COPD. When the smell comes down around my house, my eyes burn. I have a cough from smelling the paint. I feel a tightness in my chest. I've gotten headaches from the smell, and I've been living as a prisoner in my own house for well over a year. And it's not just me. One of my neighbors shared, when my eyes start to burn, I start to be more afraid of all the things that I can't smell than those that I can. Another neighbor shared, the migraine headaches, the burning of the eyes, and the tightness in my chest. I just don't know I'm out too long. I just know I'm out too long. I get that way, but I can't say today it's going to be worse than tomorrow. I know yesterday it was too much for me. I was crying. The psychological impact of not knowing what you are being exposed to and having others tell you it's safe when you and your neighbors are getting sick is really tough, mentally and draining. I've done some research and have communicated with some experts in the field. I have enough information to know that they have not done a true sampling of the air. They have not done enough to know for certain what we've been exposed to, let alone the potential interactions of emissions. At a January meeting with Eagle, the Michigan Department of Human Services and Stellantis, an art teacher from a local soup kitchen asked if it was safe for her students to be outside. She had a young child experience an asthma attack in the community garden when the smell was present and was concerned. Brandon Reed from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services responded, about asthma side of things, that's a really hard question. I don't think I can make that assertion right now. You know whether you should have classes outdoors or not. The asthma part of things, those can be triggered by odors. That's one of the concerns we have with the odors. The unfortunate fact is that those of us that live around the plant have the highest asthma hospitalization rates in the city, nearly double any asthma rates across the state. If the state health department can't make an assessment about the safety of an outdoor class for children, what does that mean for those of us who live right up on it? This brings us back to the failure of decision makers to consider us, the people who live around the plant, as they are approving this project. In addition to high asthma rates, many in the community live in extreme poverty, don't have the resources to protect themselves from the continuous exposure to the Stellantis fumes. That's one of the reasons some of my neighbors and I filed a civil rights complaint in November. The situation we're living in needs to be considered when these decisions are being made. Our community has been ignored by the city for the last 30 to 35 years. There's been disinvestment in our community neighborhood for a long time. Now Stellantis is using tax schemes that will continue to capture funding for schools, library, recreation centers, and other things that would make a vibrant community for the next 30 years, for another 30 years. Eagle did not consider health issues of residents, high poverty, cumulative impacts of Stellantis and other polluters on the east side, like the chemical waste processing company on Lycast Street and US Ecology. They need to look at the big picture and consider how things will interact. It is also important to note that though we have been extremely vocal, we have had very little support from elected officials and other departments and groups who bear the responsibility of long-term exposure to whatever it is we are breathing. The Civil Rights and Inclusion Opportunity Department monitors the community benefits agreement between the city and Stellantis. The only way to file a complaint with CREO is through the project's Neighborhood Advisory Committee. In response to a complaint filed by the Neighborhood Advisory, they deferred the issue to the state and noted that Stellantis is in compliance with the CBA. The city's law department has reasserted their compliance. The Detroit City Council failed to take meaningful actions, and it's important to note that Andre Spivey, who was a council member when the deal was being made, is now in jail due to corruption. He failed to represent our interests during this process. Mayor Duggan has been a major catalyst for this issue we are experiencing. Our community has been disregarded. He has put jobs in front of the health of the residents. Last year at a meeting, I attempted to address the mayor directly about these issues. Instead of answering me, he disregarded me and told me that I would be writing him a thank you note when I sell my house for a nice profit. It's online here for you guys, those that don't have this letter. Rather than address the situation, the mayor has pitted residents against residents and is attempting to shift the focus to blight on our street rather than air quality and health and Stellantis responsibilities. We seem to be caught between the state's failure in permitting, monitoring, and sampling, and local officials' failure to hold Stellantis accountable and defer back to the state. While caught here, we are still breathing fumes, still getting sick. So I appreciate this opportunity to share more and attempt to get better outcomes for my neighborhood and myself. Thank you.
And thank you, Chairman, my representative to lead, and the members of the Committee on the Oversight and Reform. My name is Pamela McGee, and I live a few blocks south of major polluting industries that I will talk about today. US Ecology, a hazardous waste facility, and the now closed Detroit incinerator, Detroit Renewable Power. I want to acknowledge that there are a great number of environmental justice issues in Detroit. There are many facilities in the city that are major sources of pollution that contribute to Detroit's poor air quality and whose impact is wreaking havoc on the health and environment of Detroiters. They are all environmental injustices, and my hope in giving this testimony is to share more information about community experiences of facilities in my community. My parents bought their house in 1954 before these facilities were built. The freeway, the Detroit incinerator, US Ecology, and GM plants. were built less than a mile away from my family's home. I believe that the cause of this is from redlining, and racism forced my family to share our neighborhood with polluting facilities and industries of all kinds. There are no protection for my family then, and there are little to no protection now. My family and I have been here most of our lives, and we all have suffered really bad asthma living here. When my oldest daughter, Jonique, was coming home from school, then 16 years old, she had a terrible asthma attack at the bus stop nearby, and someone took her to a hospital. That day, the incinerator was going strong. Jonique is in her 40s now and still has bad asthma attacks and infertility and fibroid problems. The city and state regulatory agencies have done little to address our health concerns. My neighbor, who lives a half a block from U.S. Ecology, has COPD and asthma and can't go outside. She has to close all her windows and has a breathing machine in her house. She takes a lot of medication and has lived there for over 30 years and says nothing is getting better. My oldest has fertility issues. My youngest has hormone issues. A lot of young women living in the Diggs apartment throughout my community have issues getting pregnant or losing a child too early, and they are all located in this area. Just this last month, one of my neighbors developed seizures. Another neighbor lost her pregnancy to fetal brain disformities. And I went in for an MIR because of difficulties myself. This is 2022. Why is this so? How are our leaders addressing this? We deserve better protection for our women, our youth, and our future generations. My mom said all this pollution is killing us, yet we weren't paying attention to these facilities back then. Now we can see how it really is harming us. It has affected us a lot. Over the years, you figure out where these medical conditions come from. Why is it that the place my family has committed to, invested in, and raised family in is not protected like the other communities throughout this state? Here are some suggestions for policy changes that I have for you. One, strengthen state and federal agencies' power by requiring regulations of harmful behaviors from these industries and shut down facilities that continue to pollute us. 2, increase their fines for violations. 3, create mandatory community engagement measures when communities have been wronged. 4, do not allow permits for any facilities that will bring greater harm to overburdened communities. For example, the EPA is currently legally obligated to review and revise standards for incinerators every 5 years under the Clean Air Act. But the EPA has repeatedly failed to update these standards for us, increasing cancer, asthma, and heart problems to my friends and family. These regulations are vital to protecting neighboring communities from dangerous incinerators. Our facility shut down in 2019 from years of advocacy calling out leaking stacks and nearly 1,000 odor and clean air violations. Yet the EPA would have done its job to strengthen regulations back in 2006. It would have saved so many lives. In 2020, our small 8x6 block neighborhood association, located 1 mile downwind from the Detroit incinerator, lost over 22 members to COVID. Even though our facility shut down, the lack of regulations to these facilities caused a lifetime of respiratory and cardiovascular problems to my community still lives with. COVID hit us hard because the EPA did not do its job regulating facilities like these, causing us to breathe in small particles of trash. The EPA were to have regulated incinerator 16 years ago, we may not have lost so many of our neighbors. It's horrible to let polluting facilities operate without stronger and more meaningful oversight on federal and state levels. Communities like mine have been waiting far too long for updated regulations, and no community can afford to wait any longer. Thank you for allowing me time for me to speak and share my experiences with you today.
Hello, and thank you, Chairman Khanna, and my representative Talib and Mrs. Dingle, and the members of the Committee on the Oversight and Reform. My name is Daya Redding. I'm Pam's daughter. I was born and raised in Detroit, and I currently work to increase the environmental health and biodiversity in our neighborhood. I'm also a lifetime sufferer of asthma. Try to envision this. You wake up in the morning and start your day as usual. You are brewing a cup of coffee, getting ready to walk your dog, or simply stepping outside for fresh air. Suddenly, the air isn't as fresh as you were expecting. It's rotten, metallic, and fishy. It's blatantly unhealthy and not of the crisp and clean perfume that Mother Nature emits. Well, that's my reality. For decades, Detroiters have fought against corporate polluters who have profited off using our neighborhoods as their dumping grounds. U.S. Ecology Detroit South, a hazardous waste facility, has been constantly among the worst of these polluters. I was working this past Friday at Arboretum, Detroit, located a mile east of U.S. Ecology, and the air started to stink. We were working with volunteers from outside the neighborhood who were unfamiliar with industrial air pollution. We reported the foul odor to a state of Michigan Eagle representative, but we had to continue to work through the smell, exposing ourselves and our volunteers. U.S. Ecology will likely get a violation, pay a nominal fee, and continue to operate as they do. Odors are not just bad smells. Odors are often volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. VOCs can have a range of bad health effects from lung irritation to cancer. In addition to odors, residents are affected by the dust and particulate matter from the facility. Particulate matter is so tiny it can get lodged into lungs, air passageways, and even the bloodstream. It is the major cause of premature death due to air pollution. Exposure to particulate matter can cause lung irritation, difficulty breathing, asthma attacks, increased lung function, heart attacks, and premature births and low birth weight. These facilities should be required to shut down until their odor and emissions issues are fixed. It was this pollution that made our community more susceptible to COVID-19. Community members already suffering from asthma and respiratory illnesses were hit the hardest. U.S. Ecology has received over 25 violations, a consent order, and a pause on permit renewal, yet they continue to have odor problems almost weekly. In order for them to operate, they have to pollute us, and there is no agency that will use their power to stop them. The current policies, laws, and regulations of these polluting industries allow facilities to pay to pollute and continue to operate while harming us, therefore turning us into a sacrifice zone. We want polluting facilities to stop all operations if they cannot fix their pollution issues, as we are paying for their pollution with our lives, our children's lives, our bodies, and our futures. Eagle and the EPA are not doing enough to regulate their operations. Our infrastructure fails our communities as well. These facilities bring trucks into our community and tear up our streets. It is a danger to our community to have hazardous waste trucks full of liquid running over 5-foot potholes. These roads should be first to be repaired to prevent serious environmental disasters. U.S. Ecology also disposes of its liquid waste into our municipal sewer system, and our pipes are in need of immediate repair. The odors from the discharge travel into our homes through the open sewer lines and seep into our groundwater and soil through cracked pipes. Infrastructure renewal should be prioritized in communities like mine. Continued use of bad infrastructure and lack of regulations poses a great concern to our health and environment. We have urged EGLE, the EPA, and our City Council to demand better operating procedures within our community. We received support from State Senator Chang, State Representative Ayash, and Congresswoman Tlaib to establish a host community agreement to work directly with the facilities and the residents and work on solutions together. Yet there are no legal obligation for a host community agreement. We have fallen on deaf ears, and our odor issues and health concerns continue for another generation. Our federal, state, city, and county regulations fall short of protecting our health. This problem should not rest solely on the residents harmed. We need stronger regulations to protect communities like ours. The state of Michigan does not consider cumulative health impacts on residents when citing polluting facilities. In this neighborhood, residents still have the pollution of the incinerator in our lungs and in our bodies, as well as pollution from 2 freeways, US Ecology, and other area facilities. The odor issues and health concerns continue in our community, and we have exhausted all our options to pursue justice. The law regulating environmental agencies need to be strengthened to protect our communities, not industry profits. Thank you for allowing me time to speak today and share me and my community's reality. Before I end my speech, I want to end with a quote. Humanitarianism consists in never sacrificing a human being to a purpose. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I do want to recognize we have been joined by our EPA Region 5 Administrator. Administrator Shore has joined us. Thank you so much for being here. I now recognize Congresswoman Debbie Dingell for 5 minutes.
Okay. I want to thank all of you for your testimony. And there's just a repeated theme that nobody's listening to you. I'm going to ask each of you some different questions, but I'm not sure that you even really know where to go. Is it the federal government? What's EGLE's role? What is the city doing? And does anybody care? So I wanted to ask you first, Mr. Shobe, could you speak to what you think the process should look like? And I want to give you the opportunity to expand on your opening statement regarding the state and federal response to the consistent issues at the Stellantis plant. And is there anything else you want to share about your experience and what you think the process should be to help address these issues?
Am I there yet? Okay, there we go. I think this process should be looked at totally different than where we're going. To start out with, everything is based off of finance instead of people. You know, it's can we get a job? Can we do this? We need the state and the federal government, as far as EGLE, EPA, to step up the standards as far as the policies and procedures, because they have policies that allow them to not consider people in the process. They consider an area. There's no way of looking and say, well, this area we can do this, instead of looking and saying, okay, we have people within so many yards of this, we have so many people, so many feet. We need to have something in the line of, you know, consideration for human life and long-term life, the quality of life. I mean, when you got people that can make decisions and stand back and say, well, it fits a certain threshold, you know, when we understand people are individuals, so different thresholds affect different people differently. So we need to strengthen the thresholds and the policies that they use to determine, to agree to make a permit, allow this type of facility to exist near people. And on the governmental level, the administration, I really don't know, other than people getting more educated and really vest in the people that we vote for and make sure that they have our interests at heart, truly, instead of just, you know, having a job or trying to make a name for themselves or whatever their agenda may be. Because we have too many people that are, I guess, glory hogs or whatever. They're not concerned for humanity. And if I may, this is not in your question, but my thing is this right here. Any municipality or part of government should not be ran as a business, period. The municipality is for the people. Our money is for it. It's supposed to be about taking care of us and making sure we have our needs, not catering to these corporations and to a dollar, if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. I'm going to not have a lot of time, so I'm going to ask both Ms. McGee and Ms. Redding this question. Can you explain for the committee, how does it feel to live next to a hazardous waste facility? And what information is shared about what the materials are that are being processed at the plant, including the processes they use, what emissions and releases are you subject to, and what policy changes do you want to see?
Feels extremely disrespectful to live by a facility like this when you are a at-risk person. I struggle with asthma really bad. I've had like 4 bronchitis attacks before. And when like I said, I step outside and I'm expecting to breathe in fresh air and it's not fresh. And I just picture the people who runs the facility or the people working in there just doing their job and not having any idea about what they're doing to the people that's literally around them. So in my honest opinion, it's very disrespectful is how it feels. And I've been told that they burn hazardous waste stuff, things that you can't throw in your normal garbage can because it's toxic. And those are things that are literally being burnt in there and it's going into the air and everybody's breathing it right back in. So it's meant to be thrown out, but I feel like it's not meant to be thrown out in residential communities. It's not meant to be disposed of where we are at. It's just blatantly disrespectful for human life. And I would love for future federal government and corporations like these to have some more empathy and sympathy for other people. So that's it.
We're out of time. If you want to just give us a quick answer. I want to congratulate you both because Detroit Incinerator got closed down,
Yeah.
and nobody would have ever thought you could do it. So it shows where action can, if you stay focused, you can make a difference.
Well, you guys can sit down and to hash this out. Where you all are, where these plants are at, where these industrials are at. Like I say, my family been living in our neighborhood since 1954. All of us have had some type of health, cardio, and especially respiratory stuff in our neighborhood. My concern is the future generations of people, because we have new people coming into our neighborhood. And even them are starting to see effects. So it's a medical thing more than anything here, than some company making profit. Really, come on, you guys. You all got to help. You all got to stop this. Our neighborhood specifically is so poison. Anybody come in our neighborhood, first thing, oh, it smells. They just cannot believe it smells like it does. I've had an MIR. I have so many bad headaches. So many bad headaches. And I know that it's got to be associated with that. It's got to be. So please, would you all just really consider what we're saying to you all and look at it from our point of view. And just don't go back and, oh, those people just talking. Please listen to us. Please. Please listen to us.
Thank you so much for our witnesses. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank you all so much for continuing to give credibility to members like us that continue to say that we have to do something about accountability. I do want to ask you, Ms. McGee, mean, it took a long time to shut down the Detroit incinerator, and something that you talked about, which was the impact and the harm on the residents happened. It's not something you take away. It got shut down, but not before it actually hurt communities. And you talked about infertility, you talked about asthma, attack of your daughter at the bus stop. What's alarming is I still remember Detroit incinerator getting tons of violations over and over again, people calling. So now I look at U.S. Ecology, Ms. McGee, have been allowed to rack up a lot of violations by the state, violation notices after violation notices, and just continue operating. I want you to talk about what does that say about our structure now? The state gives them a violation, but they continue to operate, and now they want to renew their operating permit.
Operating with all of these violations, it's clear nobody's really pressing them about them. Not to mention, they tear up the streets too. They tear up the streets. St. Albans is so raggedy. It has, like you say, 5-foot potholes on it, where when these trucks go down, they hitting down into, it's not, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. And they also come past our house. They turn into the neighbor where people are actually at, and all of that stuff be just dripping down the street with them. So you got all this here in the middle of in front of your house, all this slop, whatever, and it's there. So it's that.
I remember in Southwest Detroit thinking that smell was normal. Honestly, growing up there, growing up, you thought that many trucks, that smell, everything's normal. Oh, your friend got asthma, normal. You don't realize it was, hurting us, and not only our public health, but even getting into our DNA and, impacting, issues with how our children are learning. But Ms. McGee, when I was in Southwest and like Marathon or Rouge Plant was getting violations, I never knew. And then when they get the violations, do you ever get notified what happens? Mr. Shobe, I really appreciate you showing us and having us come to your home this morning, but they got a number of violations. They were actually operating for months, almost 6 months. Stellantis was operating without implementing the correct equipment there to reduce the VOC output. And they got violations, but they continue to operate. Are you being notified of any accountability for that to happen? Because it already happened. You were harmed, all of you. And I just feel like there's no sense of accountability.
The answer would be no. Even now, you just mentioned something, and this is something that it just crossed my mind, because according to them, in order for them to fix the problem at the Stellantis facility, it's going to require some more permitting. They've already done something, so they're looking to go into some more permitting. So this is an opportunity right now, if we can do something to stop this mess from continuing on people. Because, if you got an issue and you know that this is that, do something to mitigate it before you get to this point. See,
Mr. Shobe, you all try to contact a company, right? You try to give them a petition and talk to them? Because right now they're violating their own air permit, right?
Yes. Well, the thing is, you're correct, and they have denied us. They stick security on us. They found out we were coming. They've done all types of stuff. We tried to drop off a petition to them. The next thing is it's still being stated that they're in compliance. And how are you in compliance when you missed a major thing? You've vented VOCs into our community. So if they're still in compliance with this type of stuff, we need to change the thresholds and the policies as far as what's allowed to be put out into our environment, period. Because if that's what's in the threshold, here it is. There's some people who've done the numbers on it. I'm not going to say because I can't remember totally verbatim. But at the same time, you've created a situation where you sent VOCs into our environment for 6 months. We're talking about tons and tons that were not planned to be there.
And they never notified they never notified the state or city or any residents that this was happening, correct? And why did we find out about it?
They only found out because of us complaining and
That's
calling
right.
and continuing to complain and us having issues, And, for that to happen is just unacceptable.
6 months.
Exactly.
I'll let Ms. McGee, you know, we were out there doing a press conference about the host. You noticed all of a sudden they started cleaning around the plant with the and I thought to myself, do we need to have maybe some fake press conferences for them to actually care? No, really, U.S. Ecology begins to do this, and I thought to myself, do they do this all the time? And Ms. Redding said, no. This is the first time she's ever seen them water the ground. Yes, Ms. Redding.
Oh, okay, I would like to also add something. I also suffer from migraines, and I started to get migraines at 15. I'm 22 now, and for a couple years they calmed down, and I wasn't having them frequently. But I'm going to say 2019, I was staying with my sister for about 9 months, and she lives in Dearborn, so I'm far away from home. And I stayed with her for 9 months, and it was no headaches, not one day out of those 9 months. I came back home, and I'm going to say it didn't even take 2 months of me being home for me to start having migraine attack again. That's how quick that those VOCs and that air pollution affected one person in that neighborhood. I came from clean air to that air, and I got affected that quickly.
No, I want to thank you all so much for your testimony, and I just want you all to know how important it is to talk about the human impact, because sometimes we talk about these in the scientific or the formula that the structures are in place, or you know, some of our local electeds will only want to talk about the jobs, but we all know jobs don't fix cancer or respiratory issues or some of the issues that many of our families are going through. So I thank you again. With that, I recognize our chairman, Ro Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the moving testimony, particularly as someone who has asthma. I was struck and moved by your testimony of your 16-year-old daughter having a major attack, and I imagine that was very traumatic and how scary that can be. Mr. Shobe, I was at your house this morning, got to smell firsthand the pollutants coming. Can you tell us what you'd like to see this committee or Congress do with regards to Stellantis so we can get some action and some relief to people who are suffering from this pollution?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. First and foremost, I would like to have them fix it, and we've got to change the thresholds of what's being accepted to be put in our air. We've got to change those numbers. Those thresholds are too high, you know. And the next thing, as far as I can see, I'll share the same thing with you I shared with you this morning. When you put something that close to people that's that volatile, there are things over there that if they get out, there's no chance for the people over there. We're too close, period. My suggestion is you buy out that block, or they replace that block and relocate the people, create another burn, put some more trees in there to protect the rest of the surrounding community, and make sure that they put all the proper devices, pollution controls, and things of that nature in that facility before they start running it again. Because, well, I won't say start running, because they've never stopped. They've been polluting us from the time that they started, you know, and that would be my suggestion for it.
Thank you, Mr. Shobe. Well, we will follow up as a committee with Representative Tlaib's leadership and make sure that we're getting something to Stellantis that they're going to have to answer, because when we have something go from the committee with the stamp of the committee, they can't just ignore the United States Congress. So I want to assure you that we will take your suggestions and follow up. And you know, I saw firsthand, I wish everyone on the committee could see how devastating it is to that block. I mean, you're literally, you could throw a baseball to the plant, and you can see and smell all of the pollution. Ms. McGee and Ms. Redding, you both testified candidly that the EPA isn't doing enough, and I think it's important. I respect our regional administrator, but I think it's important for the EPA to hear that they need to be doing more. What more should they be doing?
Of the four suggestions that I gave today would help with like strengthening state federal agencies and creating mandatory community engagements. One like being the community host agreement that we're trying to establish with U.S. Ecology and things like that. So.
That's good. Ms. Redding, did you have anything on that more?
Yeah, just everything everyone else is saying. Just more regulation, better regulation, and to please take what these facilities are doing seriously, because it's not lighthearted stuff. They are not lighthearted smells. They're very serious, and they're very present, and it causes a lot of apprehension when we smell them, and they're affecting us. So, yeah, everything that everyone else is saying, I would like to be put into action.
Thank you. One final question for all three of the panelists. Ms. McGee, you talked about your parents buying a home back in 1954. I think we have to speak bluntly and candidly about the issue of race and what that means in terms of where these pollution sites are located and the neglect and the indifference to allowing the pollution to continue. Could each of you talk about what role you think race has played in allowing this pollution to impact communities, particularly black communities?
I think in our neighborhood, per se, because it consists of a lot of black, low-income people. But in the last maybe about 15 or 20 years, our neighborhood has an influx of new people in our neighborhood from all over the world and stuff like that. And since they have been here, they have been living with this. And they see the problem, and out of 15 and 20 years now, you'll see that that is affecting you, which is what is happening. And it's engaging all our neighborhoods. We have a beautiful neighborhood, I might add, too. A really complex, different array of people. And we all are very concerned about our neighborhood. And so it's like a new day, so to speak, where we're all rallying together to make change in our neighborhood, and mainly the environment, because that is our biggest problem. Is those industries in our neighborhood. So.
I went to school in the suburbs, in all technicality. I went to school in Ferndale High School. These smells are not there. They don't have these problems there. When I walk down the street there, it's houses on every side. You have Woodward businesses, and I don't see plants over there. And I feel like my mom said, in our neighborhood, the new neighbors that are here and they're focused and they're paying attention to U.S. Ecology being there, they're wondering why for so long they have stayed here and why they are here. And if you, like Rashida, you would see when you come to our neighborhood, you see the houses, you see the homes, and then right in the middle, it's just a huge plant right there in the middle of all these families. It's odd looking. It looks like it's not supposed to be there. So I would say race has a big part of it. Like I said, we're in a sacrifice zone right now. We are being sacrificed to help big corporate companies profit. And yeah, it's a big racial issue because this is not happening in any other community that is of different race than ours.
Race plays a major factor. I think it's one of the biggest factors in why they put that plant or they expanded into our community. I'm going to be blunt. Gentrification has been going on across the United States for the last 20 years. This is one of the last cities that they attacked because of the majority black, the ownership, and all of the history of the city. The emergency management situation basically set us up for gentrification. Without that, it wouldn't have happened, flat out. So, I mean, I'm a cynical thinker, but I do deal with facts. And the facts are out there. If you want to do a little research, you can see exactly what's going on in certain communities around the city of Detroit. As a kid, I lived in San Francisco, California, in a town called Visitation Valley for a short period of time. It's a suburb, for a little over a year. I go back and visit from time to time. I lived there from 1971 to 72. The house that I live in, or the apartment or condo basically I lived in, it still looks the same. The school is still the same. There are actually areas of the city of Detroit that are the same as they were 50 years ago, other than some improvements. My area has been cut off across the board for years, for that facility and for other things. Racism played, us being black plays such a big factor in this. I mean, you can, there's tools out here. You can go and look at the numbers and the percentages of the education, the level of income, and everything. You pick areas like this to pick on, period. And this area is 94, 95% black. The home ownership over there, at one time it was probably 85 to 90% black owned, you know. So there's been some policies and procedures put in place to get some people out, and that's basically what's continuing to happen. I look at this as a prelude to gentrifying us out of there, flat out. I mean, because I'll share this, and it may not be on point, but you know, you got this so-called big, beautiful facility that looks like a prison to me. But they want to paint it up and do different things. You can put whatever you want on in a toilet or on an outhouse. It's still going to be the same thing. It's still going to be spewing out the same type of things. And this is the basis for what it's all about. I mean, because I feel like they're going by attrition. They've been trying to get this property for the last 30 to 35 years. My mother was a school teacher at the school approximately 6 blocks down. She's dead now, God rest her soul. But in the 90s, the Chrysler Corporation was in negotiations with the Board of Education to buy out all the way down to French Road. These people make long-term plans, and hey, they'll wait us out, attrition. So slowly but surely, they're pushing us out of there. That's what I see.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our witnesses for appearing here in person, our panel one witnesses. Thank you so much. We are going to transition now into our second panel. I want to thank you again. And again, I really appreciate you all giving the resident perspective. With that, I now would like to invite our witnesses appearing in person for our second panel to approach the witness table. Committee is reconvened. I would like to now introduce our second panel of witnesses. These witnesses will accept questions from their, we're going to accept questions from their testimony. Our first witness would be Ms. Jemison Johnson Greer. Second witness is Mr. Nicholas Leonard. Third witness is Mr. Eden Bloom. Our final witness will be Professor Dr. Stuart Batterman. If you all may, please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Before we do, I do want to ask for unanimous consent to submit the maps and graphics that we have displayed about the concentration of pollution in our neighborhoods for the record. Without objection. Okay, thank you. With that, I'd like to now recognize Ms. Johnson Greer for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I would like to thank you again on behalf of myself and Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition for having us. And I would like to say that hearing the voices of impacted communities who work along and folks who work alongside them is critical to the policy changes that we need in order to dismantle the deep inequity that exists in our current laws and regulations. As we heard from Ms. McGee, this starts with understanding the discriminatory practices of redlining and root causes of environmental justice. For example, I tell this story often, but I was asked to do an exercise where I explained my environmental justice work to my ancestors from 100 years ago. And I found that it was not that difficult to explain because Black people are still living in areas with the poorest air quality, in close proximity to industry, wastewater treatment facilities, and landfills, even as we heard today. And still fighting to be treated equally by the law, I might add. The fact that the issues from 100 years ago are not that different is evidence that Black people and so many other people who have been discriminated against on the basis of race have been living in a public health crisis for generations. To put it simply, environmental racism is an issue that impacts not just 1 or 2 generations, right, as we saw today. It's multi-generational in its reach, and its impact is still being seen today. So I have a few suggestions. Our government has to address generations of unjust policies and practices that have resulted in environmental racism. We have to address the fact that these have been systemically cited, polluting facilities, including industrial pollution and industrial plants, right, near the communities of color and low-income people in this country. We have to do everything within our power to protect environmental justice communities' ability to speak for themselves, and that includes the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, right? So the early and meaningful participation of communities to weigh in on how a project will impact them is critical. This should not be taken away in the name of expediting projects. We also need to see that cumulative health and environmental impacts are incorporated into permitting processes, that communities already overburdened by pollution, just as we heard today, will not be inundated with more pollution, and that applications for permits can be denied in such communities. There's examples of this type of legislation that has been enacted in New Jersey, for example, that could be a good model for other places throughout the country, including our state here in Michigan. We need to move toward mandatory emissions reductions. This will require that greenhouse gas pollution is reduced, and it will drastically improve the health outcomes of environmental justice communities. I mean, directly improve the health outcomes of environmental justice communities. And lastly, I'm gonna say that I urge Congress to amend and strengthen Title VI. We heard from the South Bend 2 residents that they filed a Title VI complaint. The need for us to continue to have that avenue for legal remedy against discrimination, specifically thinking about the prohibition of discrimination based on disparate impact, because that is what we're seeing here. That legal standard would make a huge difference in the way that the quality of lives that we are hearing about today have actually played out. And then lastly, I will say that environmental justice communities are living with the ills of legacy pollution, redlining, and a regulatory regime that honestly has been created to be blind to social and health impacts of its decisions. The impacts of climate disruptions, plus the crisis of environmental injustice, and the policy gaps that facilitate it mean that environmental justice communities once again will bear the brunt of the harm as sacrificed communities. And we simply should not be sacrificed. The priority should not be profit, just as we heard earlier today. The priority should be reducing impact to environmental justice communities immediately and building a foundation to reach our climate targets through equitable solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll note that Ms. Johnson-Greer is Executive Director of the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. With that, recognize Mr. Leonard for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Representative DeLee. It's great to be here, and it's great that you all are in the heart of an environmental justice community to experience what residents experience on a daily basis. It's incredibly important to ground yourselves in that lived experience, and so I want to acknowledge that it's great that you are here. And in that spirit, I have the privilege as the Executive Director of the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center to work very closely with environmental justice residents throughout the state of Michigan, environmental justice advocates throughout the state of Michigan. And so I wanted to ground my comments in sort of 3 critical communities that we've worked with recently in Benton Harbor, the residents around U.S. Ecology in Detroit on the east side, and the residents around Stellantis, also on Detroit's east side. And in each of these communities, unfortunately, our government agencies haven't taken the steps to protect residents. In Benton Harbor, residents lived with high levels of lead in their drinking water for 3 years before government stepped in and provided the robust response that those residents deserved. Around U.S. Ecology, the state permitted the U.S. Ecology North facility to undergo a 9-fold expansion in their hazardous waste storage and treatment capacity, and failed to consider the fact that Michigan leads the nation in terms of disparate siting of hazardous waste facilities in communities of color. In Michigan, 65% of residents that live within 3 miles of a commercial hazardous waste facility are people of color, despite being only 25% of the state's total population. And then in regards to Stellantis, residents begged for the state to conduct a cumulative impact assessment before approving 3 air quality permits that authorize significant expansions of Stellantis' Detroit Assembly Complex. And in response, the state flat out dismissed those claims, making comments such as, "We did not conduct a racial or economic demographic analysis of this community before making these decisions. It did not consider the fact that, as Mr. Shobe pointed out, the residents, the community nearby has the highest rate of asthma in the state of Michigan." So clearly there's something missing here. And I think it's important to note that for many of these issues that I've just highlighted, we're either failing to make progress or sometimes going backwards. Regarding disproportionate siting of hazardous waste facilities in communities of color, a 2007 study found that Michigan was the worst state in the nation in terms of locating those facilities in communities of color, and specifically found that 65% of people living around those facilities were people of color. When we did our analysis regarding a Title VI complaint in 2020, that number had remained unchanged. So essentially, in decades, the problem had continued unabated. Regarding Stellantis, Mr. Shobe, I thought, put it very, very well. They failed to consider us, is what he said, and I think that's exactly right. They failed to consider the fact that it was a heavily a community heavily made up of people of color, a community that had the highest asthma rate in the state. Those things just didn't enter into the analysis, and they need to in order to protect those residents. And if they don't, you see what we see in Detroit right now, which is not only that the asthma disparity for Detroit residents is getting worse. And so what are the solutions here? Well, I think it's a couple of things. First, air permitting needs to consider, and really all environmental decisions needs to consider the cumulative impacts of environmental risks that residents are living with. And that impacts analysis must acknowledge and account for the continuing role that race and public health conditions in those communities play in those communities' well-being. The state of Michigan shouldn't be able to say, we're not looking at the race of this community. We're not looking at the fact that it has the highest asthma rate when making a decision that's going to continue that legacy of environmental injustice. And you know, I'll underscore a point that Jamisa just made, which is that you know, in these instances of environmental injustice are a legacy of our nation's really horrid policies regarding race and intentional race-based discrimination. And unless we take really strong, decisive, affirmative action, and we meaning all of us, you all as representatives, us as advocates, it's going to be our legacy as well. And if we don't take that kind of action, then the next generation of activists, the next generation of congressional representatives will be here talking about the same things, working on the same issues. And thank you.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Eden Kamala Bloom for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. I want to thank the Environmental Subcommittee for this opportunity. I would also like to recognize the environmental justice neighborhoods throughout the city of Detroit. My name is Eden Bloom. My family and I live in the impact area of Stellantis, Detroit Assembly Complex, and I also serve as the public education and media manager for Detroit People's Platform. DPP is a Black women-led organization that's been active since 2013, and part of my work is organizing for better outcomes for Detroiters impacted by large public-funded projects like Stellantis. So I'm covering environmental justice issues, but also economic justice issues, and as a parent in the area speaking. Last year, our oldest, who's in the room with me as a middle school project, wrote to Governor Gretchen Whitmer about living near a paint plant. And in the letter, he asked, have you ever smelt fumes? Have you ever been outside for too long that you can't breathe? Do you know what it is to suffer? Well, the Beneteau residents do. The FCA plant, which is now Stellantis, creates Jeeps. It's a big plant, and people are suffering, especially on the streets closest to the plant. As a parent, when it was announced that we'd be living near a paint plant, my initial thoughts were what it would mean for our 3 kids and for their development and, frankly, their life expectancy. An article from Planning Detroit answered some of my concerns. It reads, residents in the neighborhood around Stellantis suffer a high number of serious asthma cases, and some suspect that the high pollution levels are linked to a life expectancy of 67.8 years, which is among the state's lowest. Residents 20 miles north are expected to live 87 years. The article goes on to share that those born in Oakland County, which is north of us, on average live nearly 10 years longer than Detroiters. I think about what that means for my family constantly, but I'm also horrified for our neighbors who live right up next to the plant. Our neighborhood is 94% Black, has been mentioned, and I'm concerned about those who have more formidable health issues and due to extreme poverty prevalent in Detroit, have less resources to try to manage or mitigate their exposure. I've attended every public hearing for this project, and one of the most frustrating and counterintuitive aspects of this process has been Eagle's compartmentalization of the project from the people. After the first few public hearings, it became apparent that Eagle could not hear us. Eagle's website reads, some issues Eagle cannot consider include popularity of the action, emission sources that are not part of the action, indoor air pollution, traffic, hours of operation, noises and lighting, and zoning issues. How is it possible for our state regulators to protect frontline communities that they can't see or can't hear? The parameters they have established to make their decisions have also become a justification for the abuse. They can't consider that in the U.S., black children suffer disproportionately from asthma. They are 7 to 8 times more likely to die of asthma than white children. The fact that communities of color face nearly 40% more exposure to toxic air pollution than white communities is not just lost on Eagle, it can't be heard. I wonder what would have happened if Eagle would have listened to the concerns raised in the initial public comments, in the initial hearings. Would they have maybe looked at the ventilation plans more closely for the project? Maybe the air quality violations would have been averted if they would have paid attention to us in the first place. In addition to these health issues and the injustice baked into the permitting process, it's vital that we recognize that Stellantis Detroit Assembly Complex is a public-funded project. It's unconscionable that Stellantis, the 5th largest automaker in the world, with a reported net profit of $8 billion in the first half of this year, has accessed nearly $500 million in local and state tax incentives and abatements, tax capture, and is also having this detrimental effect on residents. The project will capture $93 million in local and school taxes generated at the site over the next 30 years. Due to the size of the project and the extreme public funding of the city's community benefit ordinance was invoked, DPP, EDC, the citywide CBA coalition, and others organized to bring a powerful ordinance to the ballot. However, a developer-friendly version of the ordinance was run in opposition and through a massive dark money-funded campaign won. Voters in the precincts around the plant, around Stellantis, voted overwhelmingly for the People's CBA, not the developers. While we celebrate being the first city in the U.S. with a community benefits ordinance, the way the administration has wielded the community engagement and negotiations has failed these residents. As an example, after 5 air quality violations and numerous issues brought by residents, the city still promotes Stellantis as being in compliance. Due to this, in addition to organizing with impacted residents, Detroit People's Platform and the CBA Coalition are advocating for more systemic responses to reindustrialization. We're advocating for a set of amendments to the current CBA ordinance that call for environmental and health impact assessments that will provide community members the tools and the data to advance the environmental justice agenda. The extensive use of brownfield TIFs needs to be mentioned as well. It's in the Stellantis project, but it's also reflected in projects across the city. It appears to be productive in a post-industrial city, but brownfield-funded redevelopment, while cleaning up the site for developers, can create new environmental and health risk and actually kind of bring on new frontline communities and subsequently displace long-term black and brown residents. Neighbors are made to live through increased truck traffic, diesel emissions, fugitive dust, potential damage from construction, and depending upon the use of the facilities, these issues can be long-term. One final note on Stellantis and other manufacturers' shift towards EV, electric vehicles. While the Inflation Reduction Act strives to address environmental and climate concerns, based upon the residents' experience here on the east side on Beneteau, there needs to be more intentionality. Alternatives to aspects of productions that contribute to climate change, like the paint process, must be implemented. There are also concerns over the raw materials required for EV battery manufacturing and the storage and disposal of waste. Without intentionality, the opportunities of the Inflation Reduction Act could replicate rather than reduce frontline communities. And to conclude, in addition to this increased pollution for Detroiters, we're living through this extreme weather and flooding due to climate change, and it's disturbing that funds and resources that could be used to repair infrastructure, make improvements, have been used to finance a project that is hurting everyday Detroiters. So the decision makers approved this project based upon economic promises, as mentioned, and flawed engineering models rather than the health, economic, and climate reality of Detroiters who are now being made to live through violation after violation. I want to thank you all for the time and the consideration and for any efforts to address the injustices.
Thank you. With that, I recognize Dr. Stuart Batterman for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Representative Tlaib and Kana. My name is Stuart. It's on. Hello? Hello? Try this one. It's green. Okay, very good. Thank you so much. My name is Stuart Batterman. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. My education and research for over 40 years has been in the environmental area. I focus on occupational environmental health, environmental epidemiology, ambient air quality, indoor air quality, water quality, and so forth. In addition, I have a lot of community and governmental involvement, and I do want to mention that I currently serve on 2 groups at the state of Michigan, the Air Advisory Committee and the Statewide Drinking Water Advisory Council. Today I want to try to highlight some ideas here that might be, that are intended to be constructive to improve the situation. I want to note first 5 deficiencies in environmental standards and regulations. First, as you've heard, I think a lot of them, or many of the environmental ones, are not sufficiently health protective. There's a lag between the science and the implementation of the standard. And it's also important to realize, as I think you heard from the panel today, that individuals suffering from environmental justices are especially susceptible to adverse impacts of pollution below current environmental standards. I can talk about this at length, of course. I do want to recognize that, for example, for particulate matter, while most parts of the country are in attainment with national ambient air quality standards, reputable estimates are that 50,000 deaths a year are caused by exposure to air pollution, most of that due to particulate matter. In our research, we've seen effects on asthma, adverse birth outcomes in the city of Detroit due to exposure to pollution. Second, and you've heard from several people today, so I won't talk too much about cumulative effects, but I do want to mention that this includes the current practice of addressing only one pollutant at a time in air, for example, not adjusting rules or policies if other air pollutants are present. It also does not typically consider multiple media. So if you have problems with soil or water, it does not affect permits and policies that might be concerned with air. Emissions and impacts from induced development and traffic are not considered as well, and nor are historical emissions, things that folks have been experiencing over generations before. Consideration of these cumulative impacts from multiple pollutants, multiple media, and multiple uptake routes and induced effects requires broader knowledge and training in exposure science, toxicology, risk assessment, GIS, and other fields. These skills aren't available in most enforcement agencies. We also require data sharing practices and platforms and forward-looking rules, guidance, and incentives from US EPA and others. EPA has initiated some tools for this, but they lag. A third point on regulation is a threshold assumption. Below the threshold, we consider the attainment conditions, and it's essentially healthy. While some argue that this simplicity is needed for an enforceable standard, this approach may not be protective of public health. Drawing from the water area, one favorite example is lead in drinking water. We know no exposure to lead is safe, but the current rule for drinking water in most states is that levels below 15 parts per billion at the 90th percentile is not considered, is an attainment with the rules. It's not considered an exceedance. This means that a level of 14 is okay, and it also means with a 90 percentile approach that 10% of homes can have higher exposure without actually an enforceable limit on how high lead levels can go. This threshold level applies elsewhere, like air pollution standards. To address this, we need approaches to encourage significant reductions or elimination of emissions and exposures, possibly use risk-based approaches as well. This is a complex area, but there are opportunities to incentivize emission reductions with energy conservation, electrification, and greenhouse gas reductions by formalizing and incentivizing co-benefits. And what I'm afraid of is that as time goes on, this will be happening in some areas, but the gap in environmental justice areas will grow. A fourth concern with regulations is their limited scope. For ambient air, we have standards for only 6 pollutants. We have 189 pollutants regulated under Title III of the Clean Air Act, as toxics, but these don't have ambient standards. Monitoring tends to be very limited, and source standards tend to be technology-based and often quite archaic. The final topic on regulations is the need to address and communicate uncertainties in permit applications and in health impact assessments. The standard that Representative Tlaib mentioned, reasonable likelihood of no harm, is a great standard. If I can proceed for a minute or two, thank you. In terms of enforcement, we've heard today that permit conditions and fines do not encourage environmentally responsible behavior. There are not enough inspectors. EPA's guidance for fines may also not achieve this goal. I also want to mention, and in support of what Mr. Bloom just mentioned, that community benefits agreements are rarely meaningful and responsive to broad environmental and community impacts. And then there's our needs to address facilities in a comprehensive fashion, not the piecemeal fashion that most permits are provided. And transparency is also a really big issue here with enforcement. We have the technology now to do real-time monitoring of emissions, activities. We see this now in the sensor world where everybody has a purple air sensor. We don't see this at all in terms of continuous emission monitoring systems. My last point here is the linkage with the workforce and environmental justice. This is not getting any attention. We know that many environmental justice communities have issues. They also have challenging jobs with chemical exposures, physical stress, and other conditions that can increase susceptibility and vulnerability to environmental pollutants. We also know that folks suffering from environmental stresses perform poorer in the workplace, experience more accidents, more disease, and experience higher healthcare costs as well. So this is a two-way street between environment and occupation. This needs to be addressed. Some of the federal agencies like NIOSH are trying to promote total worker health. WHO, World Health Organization, is promoting One Health, but this is really an area which can improve people's well-being, especially in affected areas like the EJ areas we're talking about. So I'll close. I appreciate this discussion to bring these concerns to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I do also want to recognize Michigan State Representative Sharif Anadar is joining us here. He also sits on the committee that oversees, I believe, the budget for EGLE and is listening attentively. I also want to submit for the committee's record a number of articles, one called Residents Want Legal Protection from Waste Facility, which is regarding U.S. ecology. Another, U.S. Steel must pay $2.2 million fine, reduce Detroit area air pollution. Another article, Dearborn Steel Plant to pay $1.35 million as a fine to settle alleged violations. And another article, the original sin of air quality regulations is keeping communities polluted. Lastly, one that talks about our Eastside residents article is agencies seek more environmental justice data, long-term residents are spectacle. And so I just want to submit these for the record because I think some of my line of questioning, I would say so without objection. Without objection, they're submitted. You know, Mr. Leonard, one of the things that I really wanted to highlight for a lot of my colleagues and for the record is first thing that I heard about consent decrees was with U.S. Steel. And when U.S. Steel continued to not respond to the state agencies and EPA got involved and they referred it to Department of Justice, I got excited. I'm like, finally, we're going to take them to court, right? We're gonna hold them accountable. They're going to pay all kinds of money. They're going to stop. I want you to talk about how the fact that they haven't. It's not only just U.S. Steel, but a number of these folks are getting notices for violations, and a number of them do enter into consent decrees that the federal government leads that charge. Talk a little bit about from Cleveland Cliffs to U.S. Steel to even in the past a number of these corporations, because it seems to me they continue to violate even after those consent decrees. So now what?
It's a great question. And so I'm going to try to talk about the enforcement process and how it doesn't meet the needs, particularly of vulnerable people living in environmental justice communities. You're exactly right that violation notices are a dime a dozen. They're issued constantly by Eagle, by the EPA regarding air quality violations, but that doesn't really matter for residents. What residents want to know is, well, what are you doing to protect us now, and is this consent decree or is this enforcement action going to do that? So there's a couple of important points here. First is sort of the delays in enforcement that residents are often forced to live with, and the fact that enforcement actions can take years. And you bring up the Cleveland Cliffs facility in the south end of Dearborn. It's a really good example. That facility has been essentially continuously violating its manganese and lead emissions limits for several years, and this brings up the second problem, which is that as those violations are continuing and as those violation notices continue to go out, companies continue to pollute. Companies continue to operate, like was the case with Stellantis when they didn't properly build their facility to vent their pollution to their pollution control equipment. Our first ask was, well, you should shut down until you can fix it. And unfortunately, that ask is often viewed as unrealistic. That ask is sort of not taken up by our federal or state enforcement agencies. And so the feeling that residents typically have is, well, companies are violating the law due to their own negligence, due to their own failures, and they're not being held accountable for that. And so who's being forced to bear the brunt of those violations, and who's dealing with the impacts? It's residents. It's always residents. And in short, we need our enforcing agencies to understand that they're working with vulnerable communities that often have high rates of asthma, and we need them to more vigorously use their enforcement authorities to address those issues.
So much, Ms. Johnson-Greer, we see like millions of dollars being paid out through these consent decrees. For instance, after I think the 2015, I call it deal at this point, that was with Cleveland Cliffs, which used to be AK Steel, there have been 40 violations, I believe, since then. I mean, can you talk a little bit about, like, where does that money go, right? The millions of dollars. But also, they have 40 more violations after the consent decree. Can you talk about, as an advocate, as leading this coalition on environmental justice, what do we need to do to change that?
Yeah, I'll be very clear that this is just a part of doing business for these corporations. They bake these violations into their bottom line as a contingency, right? Like, this may happen, so we will prepare for that. It is not in any way actually a penalty for them, right? They're going to continue to operate as they have been. They're going to continue to do the things that they have done. And that fine or fee is just that. It's a fine or fee. Meanwhile, the residents are paying through their health, right? They're paying through their, life expectancy being lower, as we heard, right? So while we pay, they pay, on a line item, on a budget, and that is just that. But they're not actually feeling the impact of the decisions that they made or the negligence that they've actually acted on.
I do want to correct myself. So they had 40 violations that got them into the consent decree that the EPA worked Department of Justice on. After 2015, they have 19 violations. So I guess we have to wait for 21 violations to go back and try to do more, I think, push back on them. And I think it's important what you said, Ms. Johnson-Greer, because I do believe that they know they're violating their own air permits. I do want to ask you, Mr. Bloom, because I know I'm over we might be doing second round questions, so let me yield to my colleague, but I do want you to, Mr. Bloom, thank you, because Mr. Bloom, the thing is, I know from being one of those residents that used to call that number all the time, they don't know that they're violating the term until a resident picks up the phone and calls and says, I smell something. So how many times do you, I mean, it really worries me that if my residents will pick up that phone and call and say something's wrong, I smell something, that's one less violation. I mean, can you talk a little bit about, because you guys worked so hard to get that number out to teach folks because they didn't know that there was a number with Eagle to call, and how even Stellantis tried to circumvent that by creating their own hotline?
Thank you. Yeah, briefly, I mean, we're very blessed to have, blessed. There are a lot of environmental justice issues in the city of Detroit. So folks from around the city have counseled us about what to do is in engaging with Stellantis. And one of the first things we did was, get that number up everywhere so that people had it on their fridge. We put it up on a billboard, trying to get the information out so that we could get folks calling in. That was the reason for the success with getting them out and getting them violated. Now, I will add that every time we pick up the phone, they don't come out every time, right? So if Robert's called 3 or 4 times this week already, I'm not even sure if they've ever come out, and I don't know if any of those phone calls will result in a violation. You were out this morning and smelled it. Will that result in a violation? Probably not. So there have only been 5, but residents are calling consistently about the smells, right? And then the other piece that I'll add is that Stellantis did bring out their own complaint line for a time, and that was extremely confusing because then they had folks saying, okay, well, call the company directly and so we can stop it, but then the state never had record of it, right? So it sent confusion in the community as well, right? So which number do I call? So it has been, it's been an important part of the process to be able to call that number, but the response is definitely not 100%. A smell does not equal a violation. The fact that we've only had 5 is, I think that we probably should have many more violations at this point in time. But yeah, there is that follow through, that connection between the calls and the violations.
Actually worried me, Mr. Bloom, when I saw them create their own line, because because for many of our residents, they're the watchdog. They're the ones who inform the state agency that something's wrong. And my stomach fell because I heard they actually flyered the neighborhood. They won't flyer the neighborhood when they're in violation or they need to educate them on a public hearing or that they're renewing their permit. But boy, did they flyer my whole side of East Side community to let them know, don't call the state agencies, call us. And I'm so shocked that no one actually exposed just how disingenuous that was, one, but 2, like, that was trying to circumvent the only process we have now to get at least Eagle to know something's wrong and that they're in violation. But I just wanted to, really important, go ahead, sir.
One follow-up, because it's extremely problematic, is the fact that Eagle actually promoted the number to the community for the Stellantis hotline. So they circumvented their own process, their own hotline, and promoted a company hotline. They stopped doing that once we called them on it. But yes, the confusion, we've got this phone number up that folks are supposed to be calling to get to the state, and suddenly the state is promoting a company line. So it creates this massive, and it's very deceptive.
I just want you to know, I was one of the people that picked up the phone. I could not believe that was happening. The fact that you are letting folks call a different number instead of you, that's your responsibility to take in these complaints from the public, and you wanted us to go to the people that actually were violating the air permit themselves and so forth. It was unbelievable to me that Eagle, Chairman, I'm still always taken aback of how difficult it is for people to understand. Asking residents to call the people that are violating them and disrespecting them and not putting their health first, asking them to call them directly. It's just unbelievable. And it took a little while for us to get them to stop promoting that number. Yeah. With that, I do now want to recognize the chairman of our committee, Chairman Ro Khanna, for 5.
Thank you, Representative. And I agree with you. I mean, it's outrageous that they're basically misleading residents to not submit complaints to the appropriate agency, but almost deceiving them that just receive complaints to their own office. I mean, it's really outrageous and something we need to call out. Mr. Bloom, I was struck by the figures that you cited. I mean, this life expectancy of 67 years if you're close to this Stellantis plant, and 87 years otherwise. I mean, that's a 20-year differential, and then a 10-year differential if you live in Detroit and some of these affected communities versus not. And I just think we need to emphasize that this is not a minor disparity. I mean, these are huge disparities based on what zip code you're living in the 21st century, America. What do you think we on this committee can do with the Stellantis plant, and what needs to be done? I mean, what should Congress be doing here?
Well, I think any kind of query to the company, any kind of piece that get more information about what it is that's happening. I mean, I think that one of the pieces that was brought up multiple times is that we really don't know what we're breathing, right? I mean, and the data is not there, so we really need to know more information about what's happening in the plant. But I mean, the most obvious thing is it's got to stop, right? We've talked about it repeatedly. There's 5 violations. Folks are still breathing it in. We were on the street breathing it this morning, and nothing has changed. So whatever kind of action Congress can take to address that issue straight out is, I think, the most important thing. We talked about life expectancy and the difference between the life expectancy of me and my neighbors, or the folks in my neighborhood, and the folks up in West Bloomfield, which is 20 miles north. And that, yeah, that's so. So if these violations are continuing, and if that is impacting the life expectancy, that needs to be stopped immediately, right? I mean, that's where I would go and ask Congress to really think about how we can stop the harm and then address these issues, rather than just continuing to let this harm happen without any kind of action. And that's at the federal, the state, and the local level.
Thank you. Just recognize your son, who I got to meet this morning. Amazing that you're advocating already for your community, and it's wonderful to see that. And I think that's really something that you should be proud of at this young age. Mr. Leonard, I saw in your testimony this concern that NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, could be gutted. And Vice Chair and I are going to have a hearing on September 15th about this permitting deal that may some want to push through Congress. Some of it was drafted by the American Petroleum Institute, and they basically would fast track more fossil fuel projects in frontline communities without going through even the current permitting that we have. I don't want to prejudge the issue in the way I framed it, but could you talk about what that type of quote-unquote permitting reform would mean to frontline communities?
Quite frankly, it would mean that we're going backwards in terms of addressing environmental racism in our essentially not just failing to address that legacy issue that I was talking about earlier of environmental injustice, but essentially turbocharging environmental injustice and making it actively worse for communities. Because the reality is our current permitting system throughout for a number of environmental issues fails to adequately account for the concerns of communities of color, low-income people. And when you fast-track that process and make it less restrictive and more easy for the fossil fuel industry, it's going to mean that problem is going to get worse, and that decisions are going to be made tomorrow and in the years to come that are going to have serious impacts for generations.
Would you say that those in the House of Representatives who care about environmental justice should do whatever we can to oppose that kind of a deal going through the House?
Absolutely.
Ms. Johnson-Greer, you testified about the cumulative impact on communities of environmental harms and how they can add up, pile up, and really devastate the communities. Representative Tlaib has been a leader, as has Chair Grijalva, on this Environmental Justice for All Act. And what that would do is have a standard that you will be denied a permit unless you can show that there's a reasonable probability of no additional harm, and that the assessment can't just be siloed. It can't just say, okay, this is what lead will do. It has to be cumulative in all of the different factors. And Representative Tlaib has been pushing this, and of course Representative Grijalva has. Can you talk about what the Environmental Justice Act and those two prongs would do to help frontline communities?
Yes, so that would allow for the decision making to be a fuller picture, right? To zoom out from just that one permit and to actually see what is the fuller picture of folks' health, right? Of the environment, of the air quality, of what's happening in this actual area where this is proposed permitting is to take place. And what it means in effect is that you're putting the burden on the company, right, and taking that burden off of us, because oftentimes we show up to the permit hearings and we're ready to make the case for why this isn't a good idea and how this is actually going to harm us, but they don't have to make any case. They do not have to explain how this is not going to harm our health or how this is not going to harm our children's health, and that is a problem, right? And so turning that burden onto the corporation is one big thing, and also strengthening NEPA and the provisions that allow for the public participation, early participation to happen is another, as well as the EJ for All's provisions to strengthen and amend Title VI, as I mentioned earlier, and the disparate impact pieces, so that when that breakdown does happen, there is recourse for that.
Thank you. Professor Batterman, since you have the PhD from MIT, I'll ask you probably the challenging question, and that is, I appreciate all your points about stronger regulation, and I support all of them. You hear from people, and I don't know the truth of this or not, that that for getting renewables produced, Ezra Klein writes a column almost every week in the New York Times that somehow we have to expedite the permitting for solar and wind and batteries. Is that needed? How do we balance the appropriate enforcement when it comes to fossil fuels or even projects that could have devastating impacts on communities while making sure that we are permitting the solar and wind and renewables that we need?
I'm not sure that my background allows me to answer you completely on that. I mean, first of all, it's well recognized that there are many subsidies that are provided to the fossil fuel industry which aren't available to the renewables. And so the magnitude of those are unbelievable, and they are long-standing as well.
Mr. President, I don't want to interrupt, but our committee, one of the first things we did, it had Greta Thunberg in, and we've been leading on getting rid of the fossil fuel subsidies on this committee. We have to get more of our colleagues on board, but that's something that the committee has been pushing for.
So a second point is that we're concerned about life cycle impacts. So in other words, we want to consider the long-term impacts, and when you start doing that, you even recognize how enormous the fossil fuel industry is, both in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of sort of toxics and the health impacts, which are removed from the discussion here. Okay, we have no consideration of those, except to the extent that sulfur dioxide, for example, has to meet a fairly lenient standard. Okay, so it's another subsidy, in a sense, given to the fossil fuel industry to continue production. I think that the renewables need incentives to capture a sufficient share of the market. I would say that we have enormous amounts of roof space, for example, that can be utilized, but there is an upfront cost that has to be met. And the recent legislation will encourage some of this, but many people, particularly in environmental justice areas, will not have those resources available, and there are opportunities, I think, to expand their access via loans and other types of options. I do want to come back to the health aspect, though, here as well. And, promoting renewables leads to a healthier environment in many ways. And it's not just energy production, but it's the total, let's say, cityscape, the green space, the parks, the opportunities that folks have to better their quality of their lives, to increase their well-being. And this, in my testimony, I talked about occupations, and coming back to that, I think renewables also have opportunities for many more people to be involved in these decentralized industries rather than the very small number of people that would work at a fossil fuel plant, for example, so that there are, in fact, employment opportunities as well that are beneficial, that are also typically discounted. So I'm just touching a few subjects here, but so there is some encouraging news. We will get there, but the problem is we're not getting there quickly, and areas like this area of Detroit, southwest Detroit, may see the gaps increase, and this is very troublesome to me because we're going to see environmental justice problems get worse in these areas as compared to, say, more affluent areas.
I think my time has expired.
I asked if we can unanimous consent to do a second round of questions. Do recognize myself for 5 minutes, but one of the things I want to follow up, Director Johnson-Greer, this is something I'm, hope you can help bring some light to, because it is very confusing to me that we have such a large force out there to try to continue to push back on Line 5, right? And we all have been incredibly supportive of that. I'm always struggling why we can't get that same energy towards what's happening here on the east side of Detroit, as well as with the U.S. ecology. Can you talk about that? Because this is something that I continue to, of course, commend the state officials and other folks really coming out and saying we got to make sure we protect our Great Lakes. And that is something, of course, that is a huge priority for all of us. But I do wonder why that same energy, same resources and advocacy hasn't been put towards holding folks here that actually got tax breaks, in some cases, held to the kind of same standard or accountability.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And thinking about, the economic value, right, of our Great Lakes, and the case is easy to make, right? It's easy to make the case for why we should be protecting our water, our resources, our natural resources, and we should. But there's also this reality that we should be also valuing human life, right? Beyond profits, beyond what, number of jobs, right, we can put on. And so I think that there's this element to the argument that's there that, it's easy to see why there's an emphasis on Line 5. And I think that there's nothing but support. I think with us at the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, many of our members have been in those Line 5 fights, right? Our indigenous folks who have respect and love and stewardship over our natural resources here in this land. And the reality is that that is not respected in the same way that the profiteering that is happening here in the East Side is. And so I think that there is a emphasis and a question of where our values are. And that is, I think, the underlying answer here.
Professor Batterman, I remember one time that you talked about children being exposed to this high level of particulate matter and toxins, and how it relates learning. I think that was you. You talked about so many of our neighbors in the workplace and how that has impacted their ability to thrive in the workplace because of the environmental, conditions of the neighborhood they live in and sleep in and raising their families in. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on children? And then I have something for the whole panel.
Sure, thanks for that question. So in fact, right now we're engaged in some studies looking at children in schools, and we're trying to put in filters in schools. Many of the Detroit schools are located near freeways or industry. They have rudimentary ventilation systems. Nationally, this is a problem, but the problem's impact is magnified in EJ areas because of the the poor quality of the ventilation system, the filters, the proximity to these pollution sources, and so forth. So what do we know? We know that children perform less well in poorly ventilated and poor environmental quality schools. We know that teachers are less happy. We know rates of asthma, absenteeism increase. So what does this do? It increases, again, the disparities between these types of schools and, say, schools in affluent or white areas. This is a national problem, but it's worse in EJ areas, without a doubt. So the research supporting this is getting communicated to various school officials and so forth. Schools are sometimes in a tough spot. Their construction, their operation, they're not well resourced themselves either. But you know, in the Detroit area, and I don't think we have any representatives from Detroit Public Schools here, they have a dilemma. They have billions of dollars that they need to improve their physical infrastructure. And you know, it's not clear. They have to prioritize, and nobody wants to have their local school closed. But you can't keep all the schools operating. So our research is trying to address, build awareness of this and try to do a few interventions, but it is a big problem.
And my last question, thank you. And my last question to all of you, and this is a good one, you can dream big here. If you could pass any bill, issue any executive order or agency rulemaking, what would the most important thing that you would want us to focus on, or what you would focus on?
Yeah, I think that, you know, Representative Deagle was here earlier and was talking about the Thrive Act, and I think that there needs to be, you know, largely economic and social overhaul of the way that we're thinking about our economy here in the United States and what we're placing value upon. And I think that when we place value upon people, when we place value upon protecting our people from this climate crisis and from legacy environmental pollution, and thinking about good union paying jobs in order to do that, that we actually can, you know, we can actually extend that life expectancy, right? We can actually improve folks' well-being and their life. So that is the thing that I would actually do.
For me, I'll get to something that Jamisa mentioned earlier, which is just reinvigorating Title VI regulations with the EPA. I mean, the EPA has authority right now to prohibit state agencies from making decisions, from administering their programs in a manner that has discriminatory effects on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And the problem is states just aren't really doing much to integrate that standard into their permitting program. So that means they're not doing much to make sure that they're avoiding that kind of discrimination on the front end when they have a proposal from Stellantis to undertake a massive expansion of their facility. And so where does that leave us as advocates and as activist residents? It leaves us to submit a complaint after the fact, which is never a good place to be in. So ingraining those sorts of anti-discrimination standards into permitting processes is not only something that I think would be really impactful, but I think it's something it's very achievable, even with administrative action, and something that should be done very, very soon.
Yeah, along the lines of value, I mean, one of the things that we experienced here in Detroit with Stellantis was the emphasis on jobs above the air quality and above the situation that the residents were in. So legislation, I think, that really looks at the development and upcoming polluters and folks who are doing new business. I mentioned electric vehicles before, but the idea of tying in some form of legislation that mandates community engagement that really attempts to create an ability for the neighbors to have a voice and for that voice to be somehow legislated or somehow brought into that process in a way that cannot be gone back on. And we mentioned the permitting process. I think if I had a laundry list, the idea of, opening up that permitting process so that Eagle and other folks can take a look at the cumulative impact of the projects is an important one. And I think that's it. Yeah, but the idea of like shifting that value, I think, is the most important thing, and somehow, creating some sort of a link between the employment, the work, and the process, and the community that is stronger and that can really protect the folks who could be impacted by them in the future. Thank you.
And you asked such great questions. I would advocate for transparency in terms of the health and welfare impacts, both in a permit application for a new facility as well in operations and processes that are going on. This information can be utilized and lead to better knowledge and community engagement and empowerment, I think, when people understand what is happening.
Now recognize my colleague, Chairman Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Representative Tlaib. The Inflation Reduction Act is the largest investment in climate in our country's history. But just to put it in context, we have a $20 trillion economy, or GDP, $23 trillion, and the Inflation Reduction Act is $370 billion over 10 years. So it's a $37 billion investment in the context of a $23 trillion economy. So it's significant, but not nearly the massive investment that some of the people characterizing the investment point out. I mean, it's a very small fraction of our actual GDP. So what I wanted to ask all of you is, what do you think is the most significant part of the climate bill that we have passed? And what do you think needs to be done in addition to it? Where would you focus in terms of the investments?
Yeah, I can answer that first. I think that there's definitely opportunity with the environmental justice block grants. That is something that we had a heavy hand in advocating for, seeing the opportunity for environmental justice communities to benefit directly from these monies, and to see investment where there has previously been deep disinvestment in those communities. And I will also say that, the reality of the benefits of the act, could be threatened, right, by that permitting, this permitting deal, the API permitting deal. And so,
because that is a very live issue in Congress. I mean, there are those of us on the Progressive Caucus and on the committee, many of us, who really have concerns about this API deal and what it will do. And there are others who are, frankly, trying to get this in must-pass legislation. And can you talk a little bit about the stakes of that fight when we go back in September and what that would mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think the stakes are very clear that the benefits that are in the IRA that would benefit environmental justice communities will pale in comparison to the harms that come from this permitting deal, right? This bill was written without regard for health and safety of environmental justice communities, without any negotiation or any consent, right? And that is exactly what we've heard about today, right? We've heard from folks who are living under regulations and laws that have had no consideration of their health and safety. I'll also say that the bill includes the fast tracking of projects that would continue the sacrifice of environmental justice communities, and also those that are living in some of the most egregious polluting facility areas, right? Those would be at the center of some of the experimental technologies that are actually included in that deal. So there's much at stake. There's a scenario where this side deal is, is more fossil fuel projects being green lit, right? And giving industry the green light basically to sacrifice environmental justice communities, health and well-being. So this is not a compromise. This is clearly a sacrifice. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Leonard?
I mean, I'll basically underscore what Jamisa said, which is that the direct investment in environmental justice communities is really important, because the initiatives from the Inflation Reduction Act to decarbonize our economy, while laudable from a climate change perspective, it's still to be determined whether or not that's going to essentially reinforce our existing environmental inequities in environmental justice communities, or whether it will meaningfully address them. There is, I think, a future, which Jamisa outlined, where environmental justice communities have to suffer another generation of harmful environmental effects. And so the question then is, well, are the block grants going to be enough for those communities? And I don't think it should be an either or. I think the decarbonization of our economy must put environmental justice communities first, and they also deserve that direct investment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to agree, and I mentioned it briefly, but one of the pieces in the IRA and the emphasis on the electric vehicles kind of brings this to a forefront, and that's the fact that we're moving into electric vehicles to reduce climate and to reduce emissions, but at the same time, Stellantis, this plant here has been billed as the greenest plant in North America. That's how they sold it to us, right? And as they transition to creating electric Jeeps, right, which is the goal, the processes that they're using, apart from this, motion towards electric, the paint's still going to smell the same. If the Jeeps coming off the plant next year when they're electric are painted in the same way, it's still going to be an issue, and we're still going to be contributing those emissions to the climate problem, right? So I just want to lift that up and to recognize that, just because it looks good on paper and the numbers might be reduced, the folks who are living closest to this are still impacted negatively, right? So we can make these gestures, but until we really get into figuring out what's happening on the ground, and the other thing that I'll lift up, I have great concern about if there are block grants, if there are those pieces available, then how are we monitoring, how are we making sure that that money actually gets to folks who need it in the community? Because here in Detroit, we have this issue of federal funds being repurposed for things like demolition instead of putting people in houses. So that turns into a real issue when you're dealing with these types of changes. Is it really going to happen? Is somebody somewhere going to figure out a way to prevent the money from getting to the people on Beneteau and to go into a project somewhere else? So thank you.
Well, just briefly, I agree that investment in these areas is very critical, and I am very concerned about the weakening of NEPA. And what NEPA has largely done is to avoid really bad projects and to shed some sunshine on the projects, and they incrementally get better, but the major impact is just that really bad projects never got off the ground. And this is killed at this point with the fast tracking for these energy projects.
If that side deal goes.
If it goes through, yes.
Thank you. Thank you to all our witnesses.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I want to thank our panelists for their remarks, and I want to commend, Chairman Khanna and the incredible subcommittee staff for helping coordinate a field hearing. There's a lot of work behind that, and I just want to commend them in doing this. It's so important to come to frontline communities, especially being members of House Oversight Committee, to be able to come out and actually be in the community that is directly harmed by a lack of accountability. With that, without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to witnesses for a response. Again, I ask all our witnesses to please respond promptly as you are able, and this hearing is now adjourned.